So are we ready to go? So, another privilege for us, another treat. The great, amazing Sarah Hendrickx. She'll not really like me doing that, but I don't care. Hey-ho. So, and Sarah's one of our associates. Sarah and I met at National Autistic Society conference when I was chairing a session that Sarah was doing. And then Sarah asked to come and have a look at how we did things at Axia, and the rest is history. As I said to Sarah the other day, how long have we known each other? I think you said too bloody long. Can't hear her now. So I'll talk a bit about Sarah, and then Sarah can just start. So Sarah, you probably all know, has written extensively about women and girls. Loads of books that she's co-authored and authored, and the Women and Girls book is going to be launched again next year, updated. So Sarah's going to talk about women and girls in the last 25 years.
25 years. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry if there's no slides. I'm sorry that you just have to look at my my mush for a little while. More disturbingly, I have to look at my mush for a little while because I can't get rid of myself on my own screen. So rather than just focusing on the 25 years of females in autism, I wanted to go kind of right back to the beginning of our sort of modern understanding of autism and think about where the first mention of anything to do with women came along. I have to say that my perspective is that autism is not necessarily different in women. It can be, but it isn't necessarily the case. I think what is the case is that all genders have different experiences individually, often due to societal expectations of that person, and then obviously if you're an autistic person, then that adds to the whole picture. What very much seems to be the case throughout history is that autistic females have just not had any representation or any role models. We didn't see people and thought, oh my God, that's me, for a very, very long time. So if we go right the way back to the beginning of our understanding of autism, we have Kanner, who many of you will be familiar with. Little chronological kind of journey through autism and how it relates to women. In 1943, Kanner quoted that there was a lack of genuine maternal warmth in the mothers of autistic children. There may well be earlier references to women and autism, but that's kind of the first one that I could find. So immediately, the first thing we know about autistic women is this lack of warmth. Around the same time, 1944, we had Asperger. In his study, his original study, it was all boys, no girls. Asperger quoted at the time, "We have seen several mothers of autistic children whose behaviours have decidedly autistic features. It is difficult to explain this observation. It may be only chance that there are no autistic girls among the cases in his study, or it could be that autistic traits in the female become evident only after puberty. We just do not know." So again, we don't necessarily have a particularly favourable view of mothers in terms of their parenting and the potential responsibility of that. Kanner is the person who is responsible for the concept of refrigerator mothering, which again you may be familiar with, although it was a gentleman called Bettelheim who really sort of took this forward into popular culture, and that continued for a very long time, well into the 60s. What Kanner had said in 1949 was that an autistic child is exposed from the beginning to parental coldness, obsessiveness, and a mechanical type of attention to material needs only. They were left neatly in refrigerators that did not defrost. And I'm hoping that every other autistic person in the room is thinking, well, refrigerators aren't supposed to defrost, that's a freezer. So there's something very wrong there. And he said that parents, these autistic parents, as we now know, were just happening to defrost themselves enough to have a child. And obviously that child would potentially end up having autism. Kanner denied that he ever actually blamed parents for autism in terms of its development, he said that he always stated that autism was innate, was developmental, and that his descriptions of the parents' characteristics were misinterpreted as some kind of blame. So those are the only mentions really I could find of very much around women in the distant past. If we move forward a little bit, one of the first writers in our more modern day understanding of autism is a woman called Donna Williams, who in 1992 wrote an autobiography about her life called Nobody Nowhere, and a subsequent other books. We then have Oliver Sacks, the year later, 1993, in his book An Anthropologist on Mars, introducing us to Temple Grandin and forever increasing our understanding of cows, and how if you lay down in a field with them, they'll all come over and talk to you. If you haven't tried that, you should. 1995, Temple started to write her own work, thinking in pictures. This was around the time that Asperger's syndrome first became more apparent and became part of the diagnostic criteria. So we then had this much more modern day view, and Uta Frith translating Asperger's 1940s paper. So we had this view that autism wasn't just people with intellectual disability, it could also be people with average or above average intellectual capacity. In 1999, we have Leanne Holiday-Willey in her book, Pretending to be Normal. So even that long ago, talking 24 years ago, we have a woman talking about masking, which has taken us a very, very long period of time to actually bring that into diagnostic models and into general kind of conversation about autism. It always struck me that it was often the women that were writing about their experiences of autism, despite the fact that diagnostically there weren't very many of them. And my own foray into autism came through my partner Keith, who has a diagnosis and didn't when we met. I then started working in the field, supporting students in further education, training people, going into schools, psychiatric units, universities, residential care. Everywhere I went, the staff would all say, it's boys, it's all boys. There's rarely any females. I remember going to one specialist autism provision, there were 40 students and 38 of them were boys. So there was just this whole kind of sense, and this is mid-2004, that women just didn't really exist very much. The figures that were quoted at the time, I remember in training, were that broadly across the autistic spectrum, we were talking 4 males to 1 female. At the Asperger syndrome part of the autistic spectrum, therefore with no intellectual learning disability, we were talking 9 to 1, 9 males to every 1 female. Now, recent suggestions are that we're looking at around 2 to 1, and possibly maybe even 1 to 1 in the future. So identical numbers of males and females on the autistic spectrum. One of the things that became interesting to me early on, prior to my own diagnosis, was the relationship that I was in with my partner Keith. And in that sort of work where it was all about couples, it was always the male that was suspected as being on the autistic spectrum. All the literature, all the therapy, everything that was out there suggested it was males. And so with all of this training and all of this stuff, there was nothing that I could see myself in terms of what I had learned. I didn't resonate with it at all, because it was very much this rather rigid and ancient, traditional, classic profile of an individual. I started working much more fully in the field, wrote 5 books, got an MA in autism, and still failed to recognise that I was autistic myself because of all of these reasons. The reason I started to think about myself was in relation to all of the other women that I was meeting through the work that I did. And they were the people that reflected my experience back to me and started to make me think, oh, well, actually, maybe maybe there's something of me in here too. 3 years later, I had my diagnosis of autism. Around the same time, we're talking kind of 2011, so we're well into Axia time now, 25 years of Axia. Dr. Judith Gould, well known for her work with Dr. Lorna Wing and Jackie Ashton Smith, wrote a paper called Missed or Misdiagnosed, which was really important because it started to identify that there were these autistic females out there, but that they were often being misdiagnosed with social anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, borderline personality disorder, and no one was kind of putting these pieces together and seeing the whole package, which ended up possibly being an autism diagnosis. A year later, in 2012, founded by the esteemed Dr. Catriona Stewart, who is here joining us online, it was SWAN, the Scottish Women's Autism Network, in answer to the question, where can we be what we are, to provide support and connection to autistic women and non-binary people. The organisation exists today still and has just been hugely groundbreaking in understanding the need for autistic women to support themselves rather than be supported necessarily by the experts on the outside. In response to all of this, having written 5 books, I thought and felt that there wasn't really a kind of comprehensive book on the female experience of autism. So in 2013, I set about the grand task of writing a book on the subject. There had been others previously, but perhaps none quite so comprehensive, from childhood right the way through to old age. At the time, I did a literature review and there were 22 research papers on gender, this is 2013, of any description in autism, one of which was by Catriona on teenage autistic girls. The others were kind of, well, you know, we've got some boys, we've got some girls, let's do a test on them and see if they react differently. Super basic, but 22 out of the tens of thousands of research papers on autism that there must have been. So I collected a bunch of about 40 autistic women, non-binary people and parents of autistic females, got their lived experience and threw it all together in a book at that time. 2014, a year later, was the first National Autistic Society specific Women and Girls Conference. That's pretty recent. That's 9 years ago. Did we actually think that there was something interesting here, that maybe this subsection of the autistic community might want something for themselves? As part of that conference, I was suggested and was asked to lead a group, a little breakout group, where autistic women could come, and we had about an hour to ourselves in a room, and there were about 12 autistic women. And it was an extraordinary experience, even that little time ago, that it was very emotional. Most of the autistic women in the room had never met another autistic woman, and they had never been in the same room with quite so many, just us on our own for an hour. And it was a very extraordinary experience. Now I think obviously internet and groups have allowed that to be a bit more normalized, but even then that felt like a very rare and special experience. The training and the interest in female autism has grown since that point. Conferences, training, books, podcasts, you name it, has absolutely grown. We've also seen an increase in fictional media characters that have autistic profiles, including Lisbeth Salander in the Millennium Trilogy in the early 2000s, Saga Noren in The Bridge. We have public figures who are openly autistic, Greta Thunberg, Susan Boyle, Melanie Sykes, Daryl Hannah. Numerous autistic women are coming forward, being actually the role models and representation that a lot of us older autistic women never had when we were younger. Being autistic is almost cool. Last year, I was asked to write a second edition of the book, my book. The publishers, I think, were a bit surprised that it sold 45,000 copies. over the intervening years, which is not Harry Potter, but it's a lot for a fairly niche, specialist kind of field. So I spent the winter updating it. Sadly, now there are hundreds and hundreds of research papers on gender and the female autistic experience. I say sadly because once you start reading them and each one of them links you onto another and another and another, it becomes enormously hard to stop. I think I managed around 200 research papers, but clearly there's no chance that I will ever have covered them all. More so now is a lot more qualitative lived experience research, which was something that as I was listening this morning to Luke and his participants, that's what autistic people want. They want to know, how do other people experience this, and what can I do about it to make my life more comfortable? And that's a lot of what I saw in the new research. So we learn a lot about masking. We now know about camouflaging. We know that this can hide the visible signs of presentation of autism, but that it potentially has a severe mental and physical toll. I should say that this process of masking, camouflaging is certainly not confined to females. Of course, other genders will do this too, but it very much seems to explain some of the reasons why autistic females have not been picked up for diagnosis, because those very expected traditional signs have not been seen. We've seen a recent study that says that 9 out of 10 autistic females in this particular study experience sexual violence. The inability to read intentions, the desire to fit in, the not knowing whether they're allowed to say no, has made autistic women very vulnerable. And that's something that I've seen in my own participants as well. We also know there's a whole bunch of stuff around gender identity and sexuality in the autistic population. A lot of non-binary people, a lot of non-heterosexual people, a whole bunch of stuff that's very core to people's identities and part of their confusion as they've worked their way who they are. But autism and that gender identity sometimes go hand in hand, and it's been helpful for people to have those voices and that shared experience that they found often online on social media to represent that, rather than feeling that in some way they're just a poor version of a woman, or they're wrong, or there's something just flawed and broken about them. We know a little now, very small research about autistic women of colour, and how the intersection of autism, of gender, and of culture can result in additional discrimination and additional misunderstanding, where people are expected to behave a certain way because of their culture, and then you throw in autism into that mix, and people are really treated very differently and very negatively because they don't fit in numerous different ways. On a practical level, we know that periods, menopause, pregnancy, infant feeding, parenting, and aging are all different for autistic women, and there's research on all of these subjects. We now know that polycystic ovaries polycystic ovary syndrome is extremely common in both the mothers of autistic children and in autistic women themselves. All of these things that we've learned over the last few years will enable us, I hope, when thinking about the future 25 years, to inform treatment, support, which actually takes some of these things into account. Some of these things perhaps ought to be diagnostic markers. Maybe there are other things that we need to think about and look at that can actually indicate whether a person may or may not have a greater likelihood of being autistic. Finally, just to leave you with my predictions for new diagnostic markers that perhaps shouldn't be taken too seriously, but having worked with Linda independently and for the Ministry of Defence, delivering assessments for the last 14-15 years, and having delivered more than 1,000 of them, and I'm sure any diagnostician will have their own kind of things that they just see and hear repeatedly from autistic people that aren't on the diagnostic criteria, but maybe they should be. And these are some of the things that I have heard more often than not from diagnostic women specifically. Number one is that animals are preferable than people. Animals don't judge, they don't have facial expressions, and they don't have hidden agendas. They also don't talk. Number two, an intense interest in serial killers. I've never heard a male mention this, but women particularly are fascinated with serial killers and the psychology and why people do what they do. Perhaps we should be concerned by that they are learning techniques to be a serial killer and maybe try to get away with it. In terms of food, I remember meeting somebody who genuinely could not be swayed from the belief that no one in the world actually likes olives. And anyone who says that they like olives are lying. And she could not believe that it was at all possible that any human being actually enjoyed eating an olive. The most commonly hated food for autistic people, in my personal experience, are mushrooms, and they are frequently described as the food of the devil or something similar. Also for women particularly, and I resonate with this very strongly, an intense interest in knitting, accompanied by a photographed and weighed database of at least 200 balls of wool. Other crafts are available and are frequently used and entered into in rotation. Any of those above statements, as far as I'm concerned, give an absolutely definitive diagnosis of autism, much quicker, much more straightforward, and much more clinically reliable, I would argue. So just to wrap up, and I think Linda's going to help me with some questions and stuff in a minute, is to say happy anniversary to Linda and to Axia. It's been a genuine privilege to know you, Linda, and to be gratefully tolerated by you, and long may that continue. I've worked with Axia for the last 6 years, which is the longest time I have ever worked for anybody in my 40+ job working life. So I think that probably says it all. Thank you very much, and enjoy your day.
Sarah, thank you as always. Pleasure and a privilege, love. Speak to you soon. Cheers, love.
Thank you.
So I now have the pleasure and the privilege of moving on to the next section. This is the Anime Amigos that you're going to be watching record live. The Anime Amigos do vlogs, podcasts, all sorts of things that I'll talk a bit more about. We do truly value people's interests at Axia, and a particular interest of a lot of people is anime. And so I'm going to move on to, I'll introduce them once they've sat down, and then we'll have a break, and then I will do the Axia timeline.